I'm Tamar Blickstein. I'm a cultural anthropologist. I'm currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Venice and Humboldt University in Berlin. My research is funded by the European Commission through Marie Curie Fellowship. I have a PhD in cultural anthropology from Columbia University in New York. Also studied sociology in Paris at the École des Études en Sciences Sociales. I came to this research first through looking at colonialism and its relationship to immigration museums. And this brought me to Argentina because I was researching the Immigration Museum of Argentina. And then I realized that this was a really interesting place to examine settler colonial mythologies, for example, of an empty land, the erasure of indigenous people from national myths of founding. This kind of thing is what I was really interested in. My first research project in the Gran Chaco was about those themes, about how indigenous people become erased from this national narrative in day-to-day practices and imaginaries of local people on the ground. My current project is, of course, more to do with deforestation and how people experience deforestation, how people from different communities experience deforestation in similar ways and in different ways from each other. Deforestation has a really big impact on the health of local communities in the Gran Chaco area. Changes local weather patterns. They've become much more extreme. The Chaco is a tropical and subtropical dry forest area, and it has already been prone to seasons of inundation and heat waves. But those have become a lot more extreme in recent years, and that makes it very difficult for people to even do very, very small scale subsistence farming in their backyards. I'm talking like 5 hectares for the little garden. Even that becomes very difficult. Understood as a process that's part of agribusiness expansion, has also led to massive unemployment in the area. So you had before huge industries that were not only about picking cotton or harvesting cash crops, but also, well, what you see today is that there's a really shrunken job market in rural areas. When I say this agribusiness model, what I mean is the model of having huge swaths of land that probably one big conglomerate or multinational company is making most of the money off of. The factories and shops and textile industries and all of this that were related to these local cash crops that no longer exist. So you have mass rates of unemployment, and people have nowhere to go and no work because the work they've been replaced by machines, basically. So that's another effect that this has had. As a result of that, there's been waves of what I would call rural urbanization, which means that in addition to people going to big cities to try to get work, let's say as maids or as construction workers, and living in slums around big cities that are pretty dangerous and very polluted. They also, a lot of them have been going to rural towns that are kind of becoming rural cities, but that don't have the infrastructure that a city should have, so that they don't have public transportation, they don't have proper plumbing and electricity to handle that many people. And so you have constant power outages and things like this that are, it's one thing if that happens to someone's local house, but if that happens in the hospital, you can have some really important disasters. So there's that, and these are marginal places in the country. These are things that probably wouldn't happen in the capital, in Buenos Aires, but things that happen in parts of the country that are much more ignored. This has also put strains on cost of living, because when you have these huge heat waves, people people who can afford to use air conditioning. Most people can't afford air conditioning, but people who can afford to use it. And that contributes to more problems with the electrical grid for the rest of people, and also more health problems related to heat stroke. Deforestation rates have already been steadily rising in the region, but the pandemic has exacerbated this, and we see this all over South America, not just in the Gran Chaco, but also in the Amazon. And then if you fast forward to the region that I work on, that was an area where the settler state had a lot of trouble waging their genocidal settler colonial warfare against indigenous people. In the south of Argentina, they started this process which was called the conquest of the desert. Desert meaning there's nothing there, there's nobody there, which of course was not true. They started that process in the late 19th century, but in northern Argentina, where this Chaco region is, it took a lot longer. Then there's just the question of pesticides and toxicity, because the pesticides leach into the air, the water, and the soil. And you don't have to be living directly next to a soy field or a genetically modified cotton field in order to bear the brunt of this. These toxic substances, chemicals, come from Europe and are actually banned in Europe. And glyphosate is semi-approved in some parts of Europe and has been deemed safe, at least by studies done by the company itself. But there are other chemicals that farmers often have to, if they switch, let's say, between soy farming and cotton farming in order to preserve the soil, because these chemicals are very hard on the soil, they end up also needing to switch up their herbicides. And so you might end up with glyphosate one year and with something like paraquat the next year, or they might mix the two chemicals together, and that can be really deadly. And some of the consequences of this are rising rates of birth defects and cancer. There's certain specific kinds of cancer that people are more vulnerable to. There are other kinds of, there are many different kinds of loss that people experience, and depending on which community you're from, you might experience it differently. That also goes for pesticides. The poor people are also more likely to be exposed to harsher pesticides, or to have windfall of pesticides, kind of pesticide sprays that come over a school. That's more likely to happen on an indigenous or poor Creole school than on the schools were attended by middle-class rural people's children, to take note of. But this environmental racism, I would say, also extends, as you said, to people's mental health and also people's cultural and social well-being and political well-being. Indigenous people, when they lose the forest, experience the loss differently, because for them the forest is not just filled with living things called plants. For them, these are beings, and there are different kinds of kinship networks. The people who are most likely to protest are the people who are most devastated by the effects. So, as in many cases of environmental racism, the worst effects tend to hit the communities who did the least to cause it, and that's the case here too. The people who were picking the cotton, not the people who were planting it, or the descendants of people who were colonized and dispossessed. These were people who were not rich. They were offered plots of land, small plots of land of 100 hectares per family. But this is land that had been stolen from indigenous people. The activists, by and large, are people from indigenous communities, or from mestizo or or criollo communities, as distinct from descendants of white European settlers who were recruited to be the settler colonists on land that had been stolen from indigenous people. It could be an attack on the self in a way that's very hard for Western Europeans to sometimes understand. And I think that this is also a kind of racialized, it's also what I would call an environmental racism, because Western Europeans have the right to their ontologies and mysticisms. We understand when if a bulldozer bulldozes the burial ground next to a Christian church, we understand why this is an assault on people's very being. But we dismiss it when it comes to indigenous ontologies, and that's simply because one of those ontologies is the colonizers and the other is the colonized. So there's also that to consider, this assault on people's sacred sites, people's families, people's kin networks, and I would say that these are political